The gavel hadn't even finished falling when Dale Pruitt leaned over the auction table, pointed his thick finger at Elias Rowan's chest, and said it loud enough for 24 people to hear. "Boy, I'll give you $50 cash right now to take that deed back. Save yourself the embarrassment." The crowd laughed, every single one of them. 82 acres of reed-choked swamp, $1 an acre. And they were still laughing at the man who bought it. If you've ever been the person everyone counted out, stick around. Because what happened next on that forgotten piece of land shook an entire county to its foundation. If stories like this one speak to you, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss what's coming. Drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning of the Hatchet County tax auction was the kind of morning that made you think winter had changed its mind about leaving. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and flat, pressing down on the rows of folding chairs someone had dragged out in front of the county annex building. A few dozen people stood around in coats and rubber boots, breath rising in small clouds, coffee cups warming their palms. Most of them weren't there to buy anything. Most of them were there the way people show up to a yard sale, just to see what somebody else was willing to let go of. Elias Rowan stood near the back of the crowd, with his hands in the pockets of his canvas work jacket. He was 33 years old and looked, depending on who you asked, either 5 years younger or 10 years older than that. He had the kind of face that didn't give much away, not because he was secretive, but because he spent most of his time thinking things through before he opened his mouth. That habit had cost him friendships over the years. People mistook quiet for slow. He'd driven 40 minutes from the rented house he was fixing up on Meridian Road, gotten there early enough to walk the perimeter of the property in question before anyone else arrived, and spent about 2 hours standing in mud that came up past his ankles doing something nobody else at that auction would bother to do. He'd paid attention. The land in question, Parcel 77, the last item on the morning's docket, was 82 acres on the south end of the Briar Creek watershed. It had been in tax delinquency for 11 years. The previous owner, a woman named Cecilia Marsh, who'd inherited it from her father, had made no payments, filed no improvements, and according to the county assessor's office, had not set foot on the property in at least a decade. Nobody could blame her. The place was, by every visible measure, a disaster. The reeds were the first thing you noticed. Phragmites australis, the kind that grew in dense, suffocating colonies 12, sometimes 14 feet tall. They had colonized the land so thoroughly that from the county road you couldn't see more than 10 feet into the property. Standing at the edge of it felt like standing in front of a wall. A green, whispering, impenetrable wall. Water sat beneath the root mass in black, stagnant pools. In wet years, half the acreage flooded outright. In dry years, the standing debris became a fire hazard, serious enough that the county had cited it twice. 3 different developers had looked at it over the years. 2 of them hadn't bothered to get out of their trucks. The third had hired an excavation company to run estimates on clearing costs, gotten a number that made him physically pale, and quietly backed out of his offer. The county wanted it gone. They wanted someone, anyone, to take responsibility for it, pay the back taxes, and get it off the delinquent rolls. So they priced it at what they thought the market would bear. $1 an acre. $82 for 82 acres of what everyone in the county agreed was the most useless piece of ground in the entire watershed. The auction started at 9. By 9:40, they were down to parcel 77. Gerald Mott, the county auctioneer, a heavy man in a brown sport coat who had done this job for 21 years, didn't even try to manufacture enthusiasm. "Parcel 77, he said into the handheld mic, squinting at his clipboard. 82 acres, South Briar Creek corridor currently, and I'm reading here, dominated by invasive reed grass and seasonal wetland conditions. Back taxes assessed at $82 even. Minimum bid is $82. He paused and looked up at the crowd with the expression of a man who did not expect an answer. "Do I have $82? Elias raised his hand. The silence that followed was the kind you could feel. Then someone in the front row. It was Dale Pruitt, who farmed 300 acres of soybeans 2 miles north and considered himself something of an authority on the land values of Hatchet County, turned around and squinted at Elias like he was trying to identify a species. "Who is that?" someone behind Pruitt whispered. "Rowan Kidd," somebody answered. "Rents that place on Meridian." He's not from here. No. Mott cleared his throat. $82. Do I have any other bids? He waited. No one spoke. No one raised a hand. Going once, going twice. The gavel came down. Sold, parcel 77 to... Sir? Your name? Elias Rowan. And that was when Dale Pruitt pushed himself up from his folding chair, turned around, and walked toward Elias with a grin that didn't belong anywhere near genuine good humor. Son, Pruitt said, loud enough, I will write you a check right now for $50, and you can go home and chalk this up to a bad morning. What do you say? The crowd thought this was the funniest thing they'd heard all season. Elias looked at Pruitt for a moment. He didn't smile, and he didn't get angry. He just said, I appreciate it, and turned to find Gerald Mott to sign the paperwork. He could hear them laughing as he walked away. He'd grown up in a family where you learned early that the people who laughed the loudest at your decisions were usually the ones who'd never made a real one in their lives. That thought didn't comfort him much, but it kept him moving forward. What Elias hadn't told anyone, not Pruitt, not Mott, not the neighbor woman who'd waved at him from her porch when he drove past at 7 that morning, was what he'd seen during those 2 hours in the mud. The reeds were bad. He wasn't pretending otherwise. Clearing them with equipment would cost more than the land was worth by any conventional measure. He knew that. The developers who'd walked away weren't wrong about the numbers. The excavation estimates weren't inflated. But Elias had spent 8 years working as a land steward on properties across 4 states, and in that time, he'd developed a habit that most developers and most assessors and most county officials never bothered with. He looked at what was underneath things, not just what was on top. What was underneath the reeds on parcel 77 was not, in Elias's estimation, a swamp. It was a system. He'd noticed it first at the northwest corner of the property, where the reed coverage was slightly thinner, not because the ground was drier, but because something was subtly disrupting the root structure from below. He'd waded out to it, gotten his boots thoroughly soaked, and found limestone. Not a scatter of field stones. Dressed limestone. Cut and fitted limestone, the kind that didn't show up naturally in this part of the county. He'd followed the edge of it for about 30 feet before the reeds closed in too thick to push through without a machete. But 30 feet was enough to tell him that what he was standing on wasn't just bedrock. It was shaped. It was intentional. He hadn't photographed it. He hadn't told anyone. He'd walked back to his truck, sat in the cab for a few minutes thinking, and then driven to the county auction and raised his hand for parcel 77. He might have been wrong. He'd been wrong before, but the limestone didn't feel like being wrong. The first month after the auction was the kind of month that tested whether a person actually believed their own convictions or just thought they did. Elias drove out to the property 3 times a week, sometimes more. He'd gotten a key to the rusty gate at the access road from Gerald Mott's office, and each time he unlocked it and walked down the overgrown track into the property, he stood at the edge of the reed mass and made himself look at it slowly instead of quickly. His mother used to say that panic was just impatience wearing a mask. He'd thought that was clever when she said it. He thought it was exhausting now. But he repeated it to himself anyway. The problem with the reeds wasn't just their density, it was their root structure. Phragmites didn't grow like corn, a stalk and a root and a clean separation from the soil. Phragmites built a mat, an interlocking, fibrous underground network of rhizomes that could run 4 or 5 feet deep in some places and spread laterally across an entire acre from a single colony origin. Cut them at the surface and they'd grow back thicker. Spray them with herbicide and you might kill the visible growth but leave the underground structure intact, and in the process, saturate the soil with chemistry that would affect everything else that tried to grow there afterward. Elias didn't have the money for heavy equipment. He had approximately $12,000 in a savings account, 82 of which he'd just spent on the land. He had a rented house, a 10-year-old pickup truck, and no employees. What he had, beyond that, was a contact 2 counties east, a woman named Berta Voss, who ran a small heritage breed operation and had been, for the past 3 years, quietly renting her Ossabaw Island hogs out to landowners trying to manage problem vegetation. He called her on a Tuesday evening. Berta, it's Elias Rowan. You helped my uncle clear that blackthorn situation on his place up in Callaway about 4 years back. I remember, she said. The hogs or the man? The hogs, mostly. Good answer. What have you got? 82 acres of phragmites, some open water. Hard to say what the substrate's like until we get some of the root mat broken up. I think there might be something structural underneath, but I can't access it. There was a pause on the line. He could hear her doing something. Dishes, maybe. 82 acres is a lot of hogs and a lot of time. I know. I've got 10 osabaws I can lease you, 4 adults, 6 juveniles. They'll work the root mat better than you'd think, but you have to give them time. You can't rush it. I'm not planning to rush it. Everybody says that. I mean it. Another pause. $250 a month? You feed them, you manage the rotation, you call me if something goes wrong with the animals. They're working hogs, but they're also my hogs. Understand? Understood. And Elias, don't fence the whole 82 at once. Section it. Let them work small areas completely before you open the next section. You try to put 10 hogs on 80 acres all at once, you'll get chaos and you'll get nothing done. Yes, ma'am? Don't yes, ma'am me and then go do something stupid. I'll call you if I'm about to do something stupid. You better. She paused again. What's under the reeds? I don't know yet, but you think something is. I think something might be. Huh. He could hear the skepticism in it, and underneath the skepticism, something that wasn't quite interest but was in that general direction. All right, I'll bring them out Sunday. I'm done. Berta arrived Sunday morning with a livestock trailer and a no-nonsense demeanor that Elias respected immediately. She was in her late 50s, wore her silver hair pulled back under a feed cap, and walked the fencing line he'd put up with the air of someone who had seen worse and expected better. You use T-posts? She said. Yes. And the electric wire? 2-strand, top and bottom. She crouched down and checked the bottom wire's clearance from the ground, then stood up and looked at the reed wall beyond the fence. They'll break the reeds down from the stems first, she said. You'll see a lot of destruction before you see any progress. Don't panic. All right. The root mat's where the work happens. Once they start rooting, really rooting, not just sniffing around us, you'll see the ground change. It'll look worse before it looks better. She opened the trailer and the hogs came out with the unceremonious confidence of animals that had done this before. 4 adults, dark and bristlebacked, and considerably more muscular than the pink domestics most people pictured when they heard the word hog. 6 juveniles, quicker, more curious, already nosing at the reed stems at the fence edge. Berta watched them for a few minutes. They know what they're doing, she said. Your job is mostly to stay out of the way. After she left, Elias sat on the tailgate of his truck and watched the hogs work. One of the adults, the biggest one, a sow he'd mentally named Gertrude because she had that kind of authority about her, walked the fence line slowly, pressing her snout against the reed bases, then began pushing. The reeds bent. She pushed harder. A section of stems cracked and folded, and she put her shoulders into the gap and drove forward. Elias didn't realize until that moment that he'd been holding his breath. The mockery, meanwhile, did not stop. Dale Pruitt stopped by unannounced the second week of March, pulling his pickup onto the shoulder of the county road and walking to the fence with his hands in his back pockets and a look on his face that was doing its best to appear friendly. "How's the swamp?" he said. "It's progressing," Elias said. Pruitt peered through the gap in the reeds the hogs had opened up. "You got pigs in there." "Hogs, heritage breed." "Lord," Pruitt shook his head slowly. "Boy, I have been farming this county for 31 years, and I have never seen somebody try to clear invasive reed grass with pigs." "Hogs," Elias said again. "What happens when the county road gets flooded out again this spring? You know this property backs up against the drainage corridor. When that thing floods, it floods the road. You're going to get a letter from the county." "I'm working on the drainage," Elias said. Pruitt looked at him with the particular patience of a man who considered patience to be a form of condescension. "What drainage?" "There's no drainage. That's the problem. That's been the problem for 50 years. You'd need to ditch the whole north end, put in culverts, run pipe under." He stopped. "You know what that costs?" "I've got a different idea." "A different idea." Pruitt repeated it like he was tasting it and found it unpleasant. Okay, you've got a different idea. He looked out at the hogs for another moment. Then he said, You know people are talking. I figured. They're not saying nice things. That's all right. Pruitt turned back to him, and for just a half second his expression shifted into something that might have been curiosity before he pulled it back and covered it with a shrug. Your land, your money, your problem, he said. Then he walked back to his truck. Elias watched him go. He thought about the limestone under the reeds. He thought about the way the stone had been shaped, deliberate, squared, fitted. He thought about what it meant that something like that could sit under 12 feet of invasive grass for what had to be decades, maybe longer, and not a single person who'd driven past this property, or assessed it or tried to develop it, had looked carefully enough to find it. He turned back to the fence and watched Gertrude push into the reeds again, her shoulders working. People were talking. Good. Let them. By mid-April, the hogs had cleared approximately 3.5 acres. It didn't sound like much. It didn't look like much either. The cleared ground was churned to the consistency of rough clay, root fragments everywhere, standing water in the low spots, and the distinctive smell of disturbed organic material that most people would have described politely as earthy, and less politely as something else entirely. But Elias had been walking the cleared section every day, and what he found in the disturbed soil was not what anyone would have predicted. Native seed germination had already begun in the areas where the root mat was most thoroughly broken. Not invasive species, native species. Blue flag iris pushing through near the water's edge. Soft stem bulrush. What looked like the early rosettes of swamp rose mallow. Something was already in the seed bank of that soil. Something that had been waiting, buried under the reed dominance for however long the phragmites had been there. The moment the hogs broke the surface and let light reach the ground, it had started coming back. Elias crouched at the edge of one of these small, emergent patches and looked at it for a long time. He was not an emotional man, or at least he didn't think of himself as one, but he felt something in that moment that he didn't have a clean word for. Something like recognition, or like relief, or like the feeling you get when you've been certain about something for a long time, and the first piece of evidence shows up to confirm you weren't making it up. The land wasn't dead. It had just been buried. He took out his notebook, a battered, spiral-bound thing he carried everywhere, and wrote down what he saw. Species, location, approximate density. He did this every day he came out. He dated every entry. He didn't know yet why he was keeping such careful records. He just knew that whatever was under those reeds was going to matter. And when it mattered, he wanted to have been paying attention from the beginning. The third week of April, a Friday, Elias was in the cleared section checking on the second fencing rotation when his boot caught on something hard under 3 inches of mud. He almost didn't stop. He was tired, genuinely tired in the way that only sustained physical work outside produces. And his back had been giving him trouble since Tuesday, and he wanted to be done for the day. But his boot had caught, and instead of pulling it free and moving on, he crouched down and put his hand in the mud. Stone. Not a field stone, not a piece of shale. Dressed stone. Cut edges. He scraped the mud away with his fingers and found the top surface of a limestone block, roughly finished, maybe 16 inches wide. He followed its edge to the right. The block ran at least 4 feet before it connected with another block of similar dimensions. He looked up. He was standing in the section of the property closest to the northwest corner, the same area where he'd found the limestone before the auction. He stood up and looked at where he was positioned relative to the reed wall around him. The cleared section had moved the perimeter of the hog area. He was further into the property than he'd been in January when he'd found the first stone. He pulled out his notebook and wrote down the coordinates. He'd downloaded a GPS app months ago precisely for moments like this. And then he walked the line of stone as far as he could follow it through the disturbed mud. It ran roughly east-northeast. It didn't curve. Whatever this was, it ran straight. He walked back to his truck slowly. He sat in the cab without starting the engine. Straight stone courses ran in channels, or in foundations, or in the raceways of mills. He sat with that for a long time. Then he drove home, sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before he touched it, and pulled out a county plat map he'd ordered from the assessor's office 3 months ago. The plat map showed the watershed. It showed Briar Creek running along the northeast edge of the property. It showed the drainage corridor, the county road, the surrounding farm parcels. It didn't show anything on parcel 77. It never had. No structures. No improvements. Nothing. But Elias looked at the creek's elevation relative to the cleared area where he'd found the limestone, and the math was very simple. Briar Creek ran high. The northwest corner of parcel 77 ran low. Between them, a perfectly graded limestone channel would carry water from one point to the other with exactly the kind of energy that, in the 19th century, made mills run. His hands were still muddy. He set the map down before he got it dirty. He had found it. He was almost sure of it. Buried under 12 feet of invasive reeds, sitting in 11 years of tax delinquency, sold at auction for $82 because no one had bothered to take their boots off the gas pedal long enough to wade in and look. There was something down there, something old, something that had been waiting, and he was the only person in Hatchet County who knew it. Part 2. Nature begins to reveal its secrets. He didn't sleep well that night, not because he was anxious exactly, but because his mind kept running the same calculation over and over like a gear that couldn't find its groove. The limestone channel. The elevation drop from Briar Creek to the northwest corner. The way the stone had been dressed, not rough quarried, not just pulled from a creek bed, but shaped by someone who knew what they were doing with a chisel and a square. He got up at 4:30, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the plat map spread out again. He'd marked the 2 locations where he'd found dressed stone, one from January, one from yesterday, and connected them with a pencil line. The line ran at roughly 11 degrees off true north. He pulled out a compass and laid it on the map. Checked the angle again. 11 degrees off north was not random. 11 degrees off north was the angle that would carry water from the creek's high bend across the upper shelf of the property and deliver it with maximum gravitational force to whatever structure sat at the low end of that run. He put the compass down and drank his coffee and thought about what it meant to find something that nobody else had found. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt, mostly, like responsibility. He was back on the property by 6:15. The hogs were already working. Gertrude had pushed her section of the second rotation's fence line almost to its limit, moving through the root mat with the methodical energy of an animal that understood its job better than most humans understood theirs. The juveniles spread out behind her, rooting in the broken earth she left behind, turning up root fragments, uncovering the soil layer by layer. Elias walked to the northwest corner with a long-handled spade and a wire brush he'd brought from his truck. He found the limestone course again and started working along it, not digging aggressively, just clearing, moving mud away from the surface of the stone, following the line. He worked for 2 hours before he found the second course. It ran perpendicular, at a perfect right angle to the first. He stood up straight and looked at where the 2 lines intersected. Corner block. Fitted corner, dressed on both exposed faces, the joint between the 2 courses tight enough that he couldn't slide a matchstick into it, even after however many decades of water and frost and root pressure. Someone had built this. Someone had built this carefully. He sat down on the edge of the stone and pulled out his notebook and wrote the date at the top of a new page. Then he wrote, 2 courses confirmed, dressed limestone, tight-fitted, corner joint intact. No mortar visible, dry laid or mortar fully degraded. Angle consistent with mill race hypothesis. Perpendicular course suggests structural foundation or head race wall. Need to follow both lines as far as possible before drawing conclusions. He underlined before drawing conclusions twice. It was advice to himself. By the first week of May, the hogs had opened nearly 9 acres. Berta came out for her monthly check on the animals and walked the cleared ground with Elias, noting the condition of the hogs, the state of the vegetation, the quality of the soil disruption. She was not a demonstrative woman. She looked at things carefully and said less than she thought, which was a quality Elias had decided he admired about her. Root mats breaking down faster than I expected, she said, crouching near a section of churned earth where Gertrude's work was most visible. This soil wants to breathe. I've been watching the native germination, Elias said. It's coming up in patches all over the cleared section. Blue flag, bulrush, a couple things I haven't identified yet. Berta looked at the emerging plants for a moment. That's a good seed bank, she said. That means this land was native wetland before the Phragmites moved in. Healthy native wetland, probably. She stood up. How long ago do you think the Reeds took over? Hard to say. The previous owner's father acquired the land in the 1960s. Phragmites' colonization in this watershed might have started any time from the 30s onward. Could have been 50 years of Reed dominance, could be more. Berta nodded, looking out over the cleared acreage. And the stone you mentioned? He told her about it on the phone 2 weeks earlier. Not everything. He'd kept some of it to himself. The way you hold a card close when you're not sure yet what game you're playing. But enough. Come look, he said. He walked her to the northwest corner. The limestone was more exposed now. He'd been carefully clearing it during his morning visits, and what had started as 2 intersecting courses had become, over 3 weeks of slow, careful work, something more substantial. 2 walls. Running perpendicular, each one traceable for at least 20 feet in each direction before the remaining reed root mass made further clearing impossible without the hogs. Berta looked at the stone for a long time without saying anything. She crouched down and put her hand on it the way you'd put your hand on a dog's flank to feel its heartbeat. This is old, she said. Yes. This isn't just a foundation. No. He paused. The angle of the longer wall aligns with the elevation drop from Briar Creek. If there's a corresponding wall on the other side running parallel, you've got a channel, a contained water channel. Berta looked up at him. A mill race. Maybe. Don't maybe me. You already think that's what it is. He almost smiled. I think that's what it might be. She stood up and brushed the mud from her knees without particular delicacy. You need to talk to someone who knows this history, County Historical Society, something like that. I know. But you haven't. Not yet. She gave him a look that was not quite impatient and not quite maternal, somewhere in between. Why? He thought about it for a second. Because once I tell someone, it's not just mine to manage anymore, he said. And right now the only thing standing between whatever this is and a bad decision is me knowing when to move carefully. Berta considered that. That's either very smart or very stubborn. Probably both, he said. She left an hour later. He stood at the stone corner for a while after her trailer pulled out. The morning was warming up, and the red-winged blackbirds that had appeared in the cleared section sometime in the past 2 weeks were calling from the bulrush chutes, that liquid churring sound that meant the wetland was opening up to something it hadn't been open to in a long time. He picked up his spade and kept working. The flooding came the second week of May, which everyone in the county had been predicting since March, with the confidence of people who've lived in a watershed long enough to know when it's going to misbehave. Briar Creek ran high for 4 days straight, after a system stalled over the hills to the north and dropped 6 inches of rain. The county road flooded at the low crossing, as it always did when the creek ran high, and the standing water backed up toward the south edge of Parcel 77. And then, on the 3rd day of the flood event, something happened that Elias had not predicted. The water level on the south side of his property, the side that normally backed up and sat because the reed root mat had been holding it like a sponge, began to move. He was standing in his rain gear at the edge of the cleared section, watching the water, and he saw it. Not a rush, not a current, just movement, a slow, directional drift of floodwater across the cleared ground toward the northwest corner. He followed it. He sloshed through 8 inches of cold brown water in his rubber boots, following that drift, and it led him, not entirely to his surprise, but still with a jolt when it happened, directly to the limestone walls. The water was finding the channel. Whatever had been blocked, whether by the root mat or by sedimentation over the years, the channel was still there beneath the mud, and the flood was doing what running water had been trying to do for decades, finding the lowest path and moving through it. He stood there in the rain in the middle of his flooded property and watched water move through a 19th century mill race that no one had known existed for what might have been 80 years, and he felt something crack open in his chest that he couldn't quite describe and didn't try to. He took out his phone, it was mostly protected by his jacket pocket, and took a short video, just the water moving, just the sound of it and the limestone walls and the rain. Then he called Berta. The water's moving through the channel, he said when she picked up. What? The flood. The water's self-directing through the mill race. It's following the limestone walls. There was a long pause. How much water? Right now, just flood volume. But Berta, it's moving. actually moving through the course. The channel isn't blocked. It's intact. Another pause, then she said quietly, "You need to call the Historical Society." "I know." "Elias, I know." He called the Hatchet County Historical Society the following Monday. The woman who answered, whose name was Margaret Sobel and who had been running the society's small office above the hardware store on Main Street for the better part of 15 years, listened to him describe what he'd found with the careful attention of someone who had heard a lot of people describe things that turned out to be less interesting than they believed. "Limestone walls," she said. "Northwest corner, 2 courses at right angles. Dressed stone. Tight fitted. No mortar or mortar fully gone, but the joints are still solid. And a water channel. A race. A contained race. I watched water move through it during the flood last week." There was a brief pause. "How wide is the channel?" "I've only been able to expose about 30 feet of each wall. Width looks to be about 8 feet at the interior, maybe 8.5. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear papers moving on her end. "There's an 1871 Hatchet County surveyor's map in our collection," she said slowly. "I've looked at it probably 100 times. There's a notation on the South Briar Creek corridor. I always assumed it referred to a drainage feature." She stopped. "Can I come out?" "Yes," he said. "Come tomorrow." Margaret Sobel was in her mid-60s, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and arrived in a Subaru that was so covered in bumper stickers from historical sites across 5 states that it was hard to see the original color. She brought a clipboard, a camera, and a laminated reproduction of the 1871 surveyor's map. She didn't say much when she walked the cleared ground. She just looked. She noted the native plant germination, paused at the bulrush patches, studied the topography of the cleared area with the careful triangulating squint of someone who had been reading landscape for a long time. When they reached the northwest corner and the limestone walls, she stopped and stood very still for what felt like 30 seconds. Then she unfolded the laminated map and held it out so they could both see it. She pointed to a notation on the South Briar Creek section, a small symbol, hand-drawn, with a notation beside it in the cramped handwriting of a 19th century county surveyor. "B. Mill, established 1847, she read. "I thought B. Mill was a drainage basin label. Like basin. But it's not." She looked up at him. "It's a mill. Bennett Mill. Established 1847. Elias looked at the map, then at the stone walls, then back at the map. "There was a mill here." "There was a mill here," she said, "and based on what I'm looking at, it might still be here." She put the map away and looked at the stone corner with an expression he hadn't seen on many people's faces. It was the look of someone who had spent their adult life caring about things that most people ignored, and who had just been given a piece of evidence that all that caring had been pointed at something real. "We need to keep clearing," she said, carefully. "The hogs are already in the next section," he said. She glanced toward the sound of the animals working in the distance. "They're doing this?" "They've done 9 acres. She looked at him for a moment with something that wasn't quite amusement but was close to it. "Heritage breed?" "Ossabaws." "Huh." She looked back at the limestone. "All right. How fast can they move?" The answer, as the month of May wore on, was faster than anyone had guessed. It wasn't that the hogs accelerated their pace. Berta had warned him that working hogs ran on their own timetable, and you didn't push it. But the remaining reed density in the critical northwest section turned out to be less than it appeared from outside. The Phragmites monoculture, which had looked uniform and impenetrable, was actually thinner in exactly the area where the limestone structures lay buried. The root mat above the stone courses was shallower. The hogs broke through it faster. By the 3rd week of May, they had opened a corridor directly along the northern limestone wall, and what emerged from the mud was not just wall, it was a sillstone, a massive one, horizontal, cut with a precision that made the vertical wall stones look rough by comparison, set flush with the top of the wall, bridging the channel opening, with a vertical groove cut into its downstream face at regular intervals. Elias photographed it from every angle before he called Margaret. "Sluice gate tracks," she said when she saw the photos. She said it the way you say something when you've been hoping for something and you get more than you hoped for. "Those grooves are where the sluice boards rode. You slide the boards in from the top and they dam the flow, raise them to release water into the race. That's how they controlled the water supply to the mill wheel, which means the wheel was downstream of this point. Yes, she was quiet on the phone. Elias, if the sluice headworks are intact, the rest of the structure might be too. Mill race headworks were the most solidly built element of any water mill. If this survived, then there's more, he said. There could be considerably more. He'd been careful until this point about who he talked to. Margaret knew. Berta knew, peripherally. No one else. But the sluice stone changed things. You didn't discover a sluice gate headworks in perfect condition and keep it to yourself. I need to think about who else to bring in, he said. The State Historic Preservation Office, Margaret said immediately. I know the regional coordinator. Her name is Carol Pickett. She's serious. She's not going to sensationalize anything, and she has access to survey equipment that would let us map what's under the remaining reed coverage without having to excavate it. Ground-penetrating radar? Exactly. She's used it on 3 sites in this region. It can give us a picture of what's down there before the hogs get to it, so we know what we're moving toward. He stood in the cleared section with the phone pressed to his ear and the late May sun on the back of his neck, and he looked at the sluice stone and the channel walls and the small blue flag iris growing from a crack in the mortar-free joint between 2 courses of dressed limestone, its purple flower opening in the warm air. Call her, he said. Mosend. Carol Pickett arrived the following Thursday with a graduate student named Owen, who was quiet and efficient and operated the ground-penetrating radar unit with the focused concentration of someone who had recently staked significant academic credibility on the results of this kind of survey. Carol herself was in her early 50s, practical boots, no-nonsense demeanor, but when she walked to the cleared area and saw the sluice stone, she stopped the way Margaret had stopped. That particular stillness that only comes when someone who knows exactly what they're looking at finds something better than they expected. This is dressed with a shoulder chisel, she said, running her fingers along the sluice groove. That technique was common in this region between 1830 and 1870. After 1870, most mills in this county were using prefabricated iron hardware. She looked up. This is pre-Civil War construction. 1847, according to the surveyor's map, Elias said. She nodded. Then she looked at the reed wall beyond the cleared section. The remaining mass, still 12 feet tall, still dense, running another 40 or 50 yards before the terrain shifted. Whatever else is down there, she said, it's in that section. Owen set up the radar unit and they walked the survey grid for most of the afternoon, pushing the equipment along predetermined transects, while the hogs worked their rotation in an adjacent section, and Elias followed along with his notebook. The radar return images came up on Owen's tablet in real time. Gray and white and black striations that meant nothing to Elias, but produced over the course of the afternoon a series of quiet but increasingly emphatic exchanges between Owen and Carol. At 4:30, Carol called him over. She showed him the tablet. These linear anomalies here and here, parallel walls running northeast from the headworks location. That's your mill race, and it's intact for what looks like approximately 60 feet before it opens into a wider feature. She moved her finger on the screen. This mass here, large, irregular, horizontal, at about 3 feet depth, could be collapsed roof structure. But these vertical signatures on either side of it are walls. Substantial walls, probably 2 or 3 feet thick, and this circular feature, she tapped a distinct rounded return on the radar image. Owen, what do you think? Owen looked at the image for a moment. Wheel pit, he said. Mill wheel pit. That radius is consistent with a 12 to 14-foot overshot wheel. Carol looked at Elias. If the wheel pit is intact, there may be hardware in it. Shaft, maybe. Possibly wheel components. If they were wood, they're gone. But iron components can survive a long time in saturated soil. Elias looked at the radar image on the tablet. He looked at all those gray lines and anomalies that meant, to people who knew how to read them, a structure. A real, deliberate, complicated structure, sitting under his feet, under the mud and the root mat and the decades of neglect and the reed grass that everyone had decided made this land worthless. He thought about Dale Pruitt's $50 offer. He thought about the county auction, the folding chairs, the cold morning, the gavel. When can you come back to run a full-site survey? He asked. Carol looked at her calendar on her phone. 3 weeks. I can have a full crew here in 3 weeks. All right, he said. Owen was still looking at the radar image. He said, almost to himself, "This is a really significant find." Neither Elias nor Carol responded to that directly, but Elias looked at the reed wall that was still standing between him and whatever the radar was showing, and he felt a very specific, very controlled kind of impatience, the kind that tells you the next thing is close, close enough to almost touch, and all you have to do is keep moving in the right direction. The hogs were working their rotation behind him. Gertrude was somewhere in the reed mass, invisible but audible, pushing through. He walked back to where she was working and watched her through the fence for a minute. "Good girl," he said quietly. She didn't look up. She just kept working. The first person outside of Elias's careful circle to find out that something was happening on Parcel 77 was, inevitably, Dale Pruitt. Pruitt had driven past the property twice in the past week and noticed things he didn't like. Not bad things, just unfamiliar things. A second vehicle parked on the access road. A woman he didn't recognize walking the fence line. Equipment he couldn't identify at this distance. He stopped at the fence on a Saturday morning when he knew Elias was there and said, without preamble, "You've got people out here." "I do," Elias said. "County people?" "Historical Preservation Office." Pruitt's eyes narrowed. "What'd you find?" Elias looked at him. He thought about what to say. He thought about the $50 offer and the laughter and the way Pruitt had walked back to his truck with the satisfied air of a man who already knew how a story ended. "Some old stonework," he said. "How old?" "Old enough to be interesting." Pruitt chewed on that for a moment. "The county road flooding situation," he said. "You fixed the drainage on this place. That helps the road crossing. I want to know if that's part of what you're planning." "It might be a natural consequence of what I'm doing," Elias said. "A natural consequence." Pruitt repeated the phrase in the same way he'd repeated "different idea" back in March, with the same skeptical deliberateness. He looked at the cleared acreage, at the hogs visible in their current rotation section, at the dense wall of remaining reeds. "People are asking," he said. "What are they asking?" "What you're doing, whether you're planning to sell, whether the county's going to have to deal with this thing one way or another." Elias turned to face him directly. "I'm not planning to sell," he said, "and the county is not going to have to deal with anything. I am handling this land. You're one person. One person's enough for the job." Pruitt looked at him for a moment with an expression that had changed, almost imperceptibly, from condescension to something that contained a thread of reluctant reconsideration. He didn't say anything to acknowledge that change. He just shifted his weight and looked at the property. "What kind of stonework?" he said. "Mill stonework," Elias said. 19th century. Pruitt's face didn't change, but he was quiet for a few seconds in a way that was different from his usual quiet. "There was an old mill on this side of the creek?" he said. "There appears to have been," Elias said. Pruitt looked at the reed wall for a long moment. Something moved in his face that Elias couldn't quite read, and Pruitt didn't offer an explanation for it. He just said, "Huh," and then walked back to his truck and drove away without the usual editorial comment. Elias watched the truck go. He didn't know what to make of it, so he filed it away and went back to work. The hogs were in the critical section now, the section the radar had flagged. They were working it the same way they worked every section, methodically, thoroughly, without hurry. Gertrude's rooting had moved deep into the root mat, and behind her the ground was opening up in raw, dark patches that smelled of black water and old organic material and something else, something mineral and clean underneath all of it. The next morning, a Sunday, Elias arrived at first light and found that the overnight rooting had exposed a new section of limestone wall, this one running along what the radar had identified as the eastern edge of the mill race channel. The wall was in better condition than anything he'd uncovered yet. The stone courses were stacked 4 high, each course roughly 12 inches in height. The top was intact. The face was clean enough that he could see chisel marks in the stone surface where the original dressing had been done. He stood at the wall and looked at it in the early light, and for the first time since the auction, he let himself feel, without any of his usual careful management, what he was actually standing next to. This had been built by someone, by hands and tools and days of labor, and a plan carefully thought through and executed by a person who had stood on this same ground 175 years ago and looked at it and seen what it could be rather than what it was. He put his hand on the stone. It was cold and solid and real. Behind him in the reed mass, Gertrude moved forward into undisturbed ground, and the sound of the reeds breaking ahead of her filled the morning air and mixed with the red-winged blackbirds and the water finding its way through the exposed race channel and the first light coming gold over the tree line to the east. And it was not a perfect morning, and Elias's boots were already soaked, and his back hurt, and he had approximately $9,000 left in his savings account and a long way to go yet. But the wall was real. The channel was real. And whatever was waiting in that last dense section of reed coverage, whatever the radar had shown, whatever Carol and Owen had measured and mapped and gone quiet over, it was real too. He took his hand off the stone and picked up his spade and started clearing. Part 3, The Hidden Heart of the Valley. Carol Pickett came back on a Tuesday in the second week of June with a crew of 4 and a truck full of equipment that Elias had never seen used on a site before. 2 of the crew were graduate students from the State University's Historic Preservation Program. One was a licensed surveyor named Frank Adler, who had been doing site documentation work for the Preservation Office for 22 years, and who arrived in a truck that was as organized inside as a surgical kit. The fourth was a woman named Dessa Quinn, who was introduced to Elias simply as our structures specialist, and who shook his hand and immediately walked to the limestone race wall and crouched down next to it and didn't speak to anyone for about 10 minutes. Elias let them work. He'd learned in 8 years of land stewardship that the most useful thing you could do when experts arrived at a site was stay out of their way until they needed you. He checked on the hogs, walked the new sections the animals had opened in the past week, and made his notes. The critical section, the one the radar had flagged with the wheel pit signature and the collapsed roof mass and the parallel walls, was now about 60% cleared by the hogs. The remaining 40% was what he was waiting on. Frank Adler called him over at 10:30. "I want to show you something," Frank said. He had his survey tablet out and was overlaying the radar data from 3 weeks ago onto a live satellite feed of the property. "Look at this correlation." He pointed to the radar return that Owen had identified as the wheel pit. Then he pointed to a slight surface depression in the cleared ground, maybe 30 feet from where they were standing. "See that low spot?" Elias looked. He'd noticed the depression but written it off as irregular settling. "Yes. That's directly above your wheel pit signature. The ground has subsided over the void." Frank looked up from the tablet. "When you've got a subsurface void that size, Carol thinks the wheel pit could be 6 to 8 feet deep. The soil above it compresses differently than the surrounding substrate. It sinks slightly. That's what you're seeing. Which means the void is intact. Which means the void is probably intact, meaning the wheel pit itself has not collapsed." Frank paused. "I've worked 60-some sites in this state. I've seen maybe a dozen mill sites. I have not seen a wheel pit void show up on radar this cleanly unless the structural walls were still holding." Elias looked at the depression in the ground, 30 feet away. 2, maybe 3 weeks of hog work remaining before the animals had the root mat cleared enough to access it safely. 3 weeks felt like a very long time. The person who blew Elias's careful containment of the story was not Pruitt, and was not Margaret, and was not anyone he'd have predicted. It was Owen, the graduate student, who posted a photograph on a regional history enthusiast forum with the caption, "Possible pre-Civil War mill race discovery, Hatchet County, site work ongoing. More soon." The photo showed the sluice headwork stone, just the stone, nothing identifiable about location, and it got 14 responses in 2 hours, 3 of which were from people who knew their 19th century milling history well enough to understand exactly what they were looking at. Owen took it down within a day, but by then it had been screenshotted. Elias found out about it from Margaret, who called him on a Thursday evening with a tone in her voice that was carefully neutral in the way that meant she was managing something. "Owen posted a photo," she said. "I know," Elias said. He'd already called Carol, who had already called Owen, who had apparently spent a miserable afternoon understanding the professional implications of what he'd done. "It's down." The forum moderator saved it. "There are people asking questions. A man named Gerald Tim, he runs a milling history group out of the university, has emailed me twice today." Elias sat down at the kitchen table. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. But Elias, Gerald Tim is not a person you want to obstruct. He's been documenting watermill sites in this region for 30 years. If what's under your property is what we think it is, you're going to need his expertise eventually. Eventually is different from now. I know, but now is here. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the evening was coming in slow and warm. He could hear the spring peepers going in the wetland section. They'd shown up about 3 weeks ago, and the sound of them at dusk had become something he looked forward to without quite realizing it. "Tell Tim I'll call him when the site is properly documented," he said. "Not before. He won't like that. He doesn't have to like it." Margaret sighed. "You're a stubborn man. People keep telling me that. It's not entirely a compliment." "I know," he said, "but it's getting things done." Bishop. The third week of June brought heat that sat on the county like a damp cloth and didn't let up. Elias worked the early mornings and evenings and stayed out of the sun in the middle part of the day. The hogs didn't much care about the heat, or if they did, they expressed it by working slightly slower rather than stopping altogether, which he considered admirable. The critical section was down to its last significant reed stand, a dense column of phragmites running along the south edge of the radar's structural signatures. The hogs were into it. He could hear them working it from 20 yards away, the rhythmic crash and break of stems going down under Gertrude's shoulders. Dessa came out twice that week to look at the emerging structure. She measured everything she could access, made drawings in a field sketchbook with the rapid, precise lines of someone who had learned to capture what she saw before conditions changed, and asked Elias questions that told him her picture of the site was already sharper than his. "The race walls are 2 feet 6 inches thick at the base," she said on her second visit Thursday morning, "wider than standard. The original builder was expecting to carry significant flow volume." "What does that tell you?" "That the wheel was probably large. Big wheel, high flow volume, serious power output. This wasn't a modest one-room grist operation. Somebody built this to do real work." She looked at her sketchbook. "There's a secondary limestone feature on the south bank of the race. I've been trying to get a clear look at it. Can the hogs open that section sooner?" "The rotation is the rotation," Elias said. "I can't push it without Berta's say-so." Dessa looked at him with the expression of someone who found constraints professionally inconvenient but personally respected. "Call Berta," she said. He called Berta that afternoon. "You want me to adjust the rotation," Berta said. "The structure specialist needs access to the south bank section." A pause. "The animals are still working the primary section." "I know. Is there any way to open a corridor on the south bank without moving the full rotation?" Another pause. "I can bring 2 of the juveniles out of rotation and pen them in a narrow corridor along the south bank. They'll work it, but it'll take longer than the full group." "How much longer?" "Week, maybe week and a half." "That works?" "I'm bringing them out myself," Berta said. "I want to see what's happening down there anyway." She came out Saturday. By then the main rotation section had opened enough that the outline of the structural features was becoming visible even to untrained eyes. Berta walked the site with the deliberate attention she always brought to new ground, and when she got to the emerging wall lines and the depression above the wheel pit, she stopped and stood there the same way everyone else had. That particular stillness. "Lord," she said softly. "I thought you didn't say that," Elias said. "I say it when I mean it," she said. She looked at the 2 juvenile hogs she'd brought, who were already investigating the fence of their new corridor section. "You know what this is, don't you?" It wasn't quite a question. "I think so," he said. "Whole mill." "That's what the radar suggests. Carol thinks the wheel pit is intact. Dessa thinks the structure footprint is larger than we've been assuming." Berta looked at the reed wall that still covered the south bank section. And nobody knew. Nobody looked. She shook her head slowly. "That land sits across the road from Dale Pruitt for 30 years, and he never once thought to wade in and look at what was growing over it. He thought he already knew what it was." Berta glanced at him. "And you didn't?" "No." "Why not?" He thought about it for a second. "Because I didn't have anything to lose by looking," he said. "I wasn't protecting a position. I didn't have a conclusion I was trying to keep." Berta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a harder thing than it sounds." Quote, the first day of July. Elias arrived at the property at 5:50 in the morning, before the sun was fully up, because he had not slept more than 4 hours and had given up pretending he was going to. The two juveniles had been working the South Bank corridor for 9 days. The main rotation had pushed the primary section to within 20 feet of the radar signatures. Today, or tomorrow at the latest, the Hogs would reach the last stand of reeds above the Wheel Pit Depression. He opened the gate, walked the access road, and saw immediately that something had changed overnight. The South Bank reed stand was down. Not partially, fully. The juveniles had broken through the last of it sometime in the night, and the corridor Berta had fenced lay open, the root mat churned and broken, the ground raw and dark and wet. He climbed through the fence into the cleared corridor. His boots sank in the mud, and he moved carefully. In the early light, still gray and low, he could see stone. Not just the race wall on the north side. Stone on the south side, too, emerging from the broken root mat in a line that ran east, following the race, and then turned south. He followed it. The South Bank structure was not a wall. It was a floor. A stone-laid floor, flat and level, extending south from the race bank for what looked like 15, maybe 18 feet. And at the south edge of the floor, emerging from the last fringe of root mat that the juveniles hadn't quite reached, was something vertical. Stone, again. But taller. 2-3 feet above the floor level. He crossed the floor. It was solid under his boots. Not a single stone shifted. And crouched at the vertical feature. It was a hearth. Not just a hearth. A forge hearth. Stone-lined, deep-flued, the interior face darkened black with decades or centuries of combustion that had cooked the stone surface to a glaze. At its base, the ash had long since washed away, but the fire-altered stone told the story clearly enough. This had burned hot, regularly, for a long time. He sat back on his heels in the mud and breathed. A blacksmith shop. The radar's secondary mass on the South Bank was not collapsed roof structure, or not only that, it was a smithy. A forge and floor and walls, attached to the mill complex, right where it would need to be to supply ironwork for mill maintenance and for the community the mill served. He took out his phone and called Dessa Quinn. It was 6:15 in the morning. She picked up on the third ring, sounding entirely awake. What happened? South Bank cleared overnight, he said. There's a forge floor, hearth intact, stone-laid, fire-glazed interior, the whole thing. A sharp intake of breath. I'll be there by 8. She was there by 7:40. So Carol Pickett arrived an hour after Dessa. She brought Frank Adler and, because events had moved faster than anyone's careful scheduling, Gerald Tim. Elias had not called Gerald Tim. Carol had, because she'd decided on the drive over that the moment was past where Elias's preference for containment could hold against the professional reality of what this site was becoming. She pulled Elias aside when she arrived. Gerald's here, she said. I made a call. He looked at the man climbing out of the passenger seat of Carol's truck. Gerald Tim was in his early 70s, wire-rimmed glasses, a canvas field hat that had seen better decades, and a camera bag slung over one shoulder. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone whose knees had been through a lot of field work. You should have told me, Elias said to Carol. Yes, she said, but you would have said no, and I would have had to call him anyway eventually, and we would have lost time. She looked at him directly. I'm sorry, but I need you to let this proceed. He looked at Tim, who was standing at the property gate looking at the cleared acreage with an expression that was immediately readable even from 20 feet away. It was the expression of a man who had spent 30 years of his life caring about something and had just, unexpectedly, been brought face to face with the reason why. Elias let out a breath. Fine, he said. He walked over. Mr. Tim, Elias Rowan, this is my property. Tim turned and shook his hand with a grip that was firmer than Elias expected. I know who you are, Tim said. I've been trying to reach you. I know. I understand why you were cautious. He looked at the cleared ground, at the hogs visible in their section, at the emerging stone features. Is the wheel pit what I think it is? We'll find out today, Elias said. The main rotation hogs broke through the last reed stand above the wheel pit depression at 11:17 that morning. Elias was standing at the edge of the cleared area with Carol, Frank, Dessa, Tim, and Margaret, who had arrived an hour earlier with her laminated map and her clipboard, looking slightly out of breath. When Gertrude pushed through the final column of phragmite stems and the ground on the other side of the reed stand came into view. The depression was larger than it looked from the cleared side, and it was not, as they'd hoped, simply a void in the subsurface. The southern edge of the depression had partially collapsed inward at some point, not recently, probably decades ago, creating a sloped face of exposed earth and root material that descended into what was clearly, unmistakably, the opening of a stone-lined pit. "There," Frank said quietly. They moved around the depression carefully. Frank measured. Dessa photographed. Tim said nothing at all. He stood at the edge of the pit opening and looked down into it, and his face did something complicated that Elias watched without saying anything. The wheel pit was 8 feet across, stone-lined on all 4 sides with the same dressed limestone as the race walls, and its floor, visible at approximately 6 feet below the current ground surface, was intact, not collapsed, not filled with debris to its foundations. Intact, with sediment accumulated over the years of the reed colonization, but the walls straight and the corners tight and the stone as solid as the day it was laid. And resting in the sediment at the bottom of the pit, visible as a dark mass of corroded iron against the lighter-colored limestone floor, was the axle. The mill wheel axle. Iron, lying horizontal across the pit, still in position, still in the original bearing blocks that had been set into the east and west pit walls. The wood of the wheel itself was long gone. Submerged wood didn't last forever, and whatever had happened to the water supply to this site when the mill ceased operating, the wheel had eventually deteriorated and its timbers had either rotted away or been removed. But the iron axle remained, 12, 14 inches in diameter, easily 8 feet long, lying in the sediment with the settled permanence of something that had not been disturbed in a very long time. Tim made a sound that Elias couldn't quite categorize. It was not a word. "Gerald," Carol said. "Give me a minute," he said. Nobody spoke. The hogs worked somewhere behind them. A great blue heron that had been working the open water in the cleared wetland section lifted off with its prehistoric wing beat and crossed overhead. The red-winged blackbirds were going in the bull rush. Tim took his glasses off and cleaned them on his shirt and put them back on, which Elias understood had nothing to do with the glasses. "I've been documenting mill sites in this region for 31 years, Tim said. His voice was steady. "I have found 3 sites with extant structural remains. One with a partial race wall, one with a foundation outline, one with a silted-over wheel pit that we couldn't access." He looked at the axle lying in the stone pit. "I have never found anything like this." "Intact wheel pit," Frank said. "Intact axle in bearing." "Intact race," Dessa added. "Intact headworks with sluice tracks, intact forge floor, and hearth on the south bank." "How much of the superstructure?" Tim asked. "We don't know yet," Carol said. "The radar signatures north of the wheel pit suggest there's more. We think there may be mill building foundation walls, possibly the sawmill platform." Tim looked at Elias. "You bought this for $82. $82, Elias said. Tim looked at the wheel pit again. "The county auctioned it." "Tax delinquency." Tim shook his head slowly. "Do you know how many sites like this have been lost, dozed under, built over, stripped for fill material? Do you have any idea?" He stopped himself. "I'm sorry, that's not your burden." "It's all right," Elias said. "What's your plan for the site?" It was the question Elias had been carrying around for weeks, turning it over in the evenings after the work was done, sitting with the coffee that went cold and the plat map and his notebook. He'd known since at least the forge floor, probably since the sluice stone, that whatever came next was going to be a decision that extended well past his own preferences and resources. It was going to involve other people. It had to. "Careful," he said. "My plan for the site is careful." Tim almost smiled. "That's not an answer." "It's the only honest one I've got right now." The following 2 weeks were the most complicated of Elias's life up to that point, and his life had not been short on complications. The site, once Carol filed the preliminary survey documentation with the State Preservation Office, moved from private landowner project to formal discovery almost overnight. Not because anyone took it away from him, his ownership of Parcel 77 was clean and recorded, and no one disputed it, but because the professional and institutional machinery around a site of this significance had its own momentum, and that momentum was not always easy to direct. Carol was good about keeping him informed. Dessa was better. She called him every day, sometimes twice, and gave him real information rather than institutional reassurances. Margaret, who had been quietly compiling historical records from the county archives since her first visit, showed up at his house one evening with a box of photocopied documents and a look on her face that had moved somewhere past excitement into something quieter and more serious. "I found the original land grant," she said, setting the box on his kitchen table. 1844. The mill was built by a man named Aldous Bennett. He came up from Virginia, acquired the creek rights in the land, and built the mill over about 3 years. Bennett, Elias said. The name on the 1871 surveyor's map, B. Mill. His family operated it until 1902, Margaret said. After that, there was a fire. Not a total loss, but the mill building was damaged significantly, and the family couldn't afford the reconstruction. They abandoned the operation, and eventually the property passed through a series of owners until the Marsh family got it in the 1960s. She paused. Elias, in 1902, when the Bennetts abandoned the site, they didn't strip it. They didn't remove the machinery or the ironwork. They just left. He looked at her. They just left. Closed the sluice, let the water drain down, walked away. She set a photocopied document on top of the box. A handwritten letter, the original script barely legible through 2 rounds of reproduction. This is a letter from Eleanor Bennett, Aldous Bennett's granddaughter, to the county recorder's office dated October 1902, notifying them that the mill was ceasing operations. She asks at the end that the county keep a record of the structure for... Margaret found the line on the page. The consideration of future generations who may value what we cannot, in our present distress, maintain. Elias read it twice. He put the photocopy down on the table and sat back in his chair. Eleanor Bennett had closed the sluice gate, had slid the boards down into the tracks cut into the headwork stone, had shut off the water. And then the Reeds had come, slowly, over decades, and buried everything she'd left behind, and the county had written it off as a drainage feature on a plat map, and the land had gone tax delinquent, and 3 developers had looked at it from their truck windows and driven away. And Eleanor Bennett had asked, in a letter that sat in the county recorder's archive for 120 years, that someone pay attention to what she left. She wrote that, Elias said. She wrote that, Margaret said. He was quiet for a long time. About that. The afternoon of July 19th, Frank Adler's survey crew finished their full documentation of the exposed structural elements, and Gerald Timm submitted his preliminary assessment to the State Historic Preservation Office. The assessment was 9 pages long. Elias read every word of it. Timm had identified 7 distinct structural features on the site. The mill race headworks with intact sluice gate tracks, the mill race channel running 63 feet from headworks to wheel pit, the wheel pit with iron axle in original bearing blocks, what Timm assessed as the foundation outline of the main mill building on the north bank, the forge floor and hearth on the south bank, a fragmentary stone feature northeast of the mill building foundation that Timm believed was a sawmill platform, and a stone culvert on the east edge of the property that connected the racetail race back to Briar Creek. The culvert. Elias had found that one himself, the week before, following the race channel downstream to where it exited the structure. The culvert was intact, blocked with sediment, but intact. A stone-arched culvert 3 feet across, running about 40 feet from the tail race outlet to the creek bank. When that culvert was cleared, when the sluice was opened, water would move from Briar Creek through the headworks, down the 63-foot race through the wheel pit, and out the tail race culvert back to the creek. The mill race would run again. Timm's assessment called the site one of the most significant antebellum watermill complexes discovered in this region in the past 4 decades, and recommended immediate nomination to the state and national historic registers. He also wrote, in the last paragraph, something that Elias read 3 times. The discovery of this site is attributable entirely to the unconventional land management approach of the property owner, whose patient and ecologically informed work revealed structural evidence that multiple professional assessments and development surveys over the preceding decades had failed to detect. The preservation community owes this landowner a debt that can only partially be repaid by ensuring the site is protected and interpreted for the public benefit he has made possible. Elias set the report down on the kitchen table. Outside, it was raining. A steady, low-pressure summer rain that was good for the recovering wetland vegetation, and good for the creek, and good for the county road's perpetually flooded low crossing, which had not flooded once since the hogs had begun breaking up the root mat, and the natural drainage of the property had started reasserting itself. He thought about Dale Pruitt. He thought about the county auction, the gavel, the cold morning, the laughter. He thought about Eleanor Bennett closing the sluice gate in October 1902 and asking in careful handwriting that someone pay attention. He picked up his phone and called Berta. "The assessment came in," he said when she picked up. "And?" "It's significant. Tim's recommending National Register nomination." A pause. Then quietly, "Well, yeah. How are the hogs?" He almost laughed. The question was so entirely Berta that it reset something in him. "They're good. Gertrude's been working the sawmill platform section. She found another stone course this morning." "Of course she did," Berta said. "She knows what she's doing." "She does," he said. "She really does." He put the phone down and sat in the rain sound and the peeper sound coming from the recovering wetland, and he thought that the property that everyone in Hatchet County had agreed was the most worthless piece of ground in the watershed had just been officially described in a 9-page professional assessment as one of the most significant historic sites in the region. $82, 82 acres, $1 an acre for land that held, underneath its tangled and neglected surface, a story 175 years old, waiting for someone patient enough and stubborn enough and willing enough to get their boots wet to find it. The rain kept coming. Somewhere on the property, in the open water of the recovering wetland, something splashed. A beaver, maybe, or a great blue heron landing. He'd started seeing beaver sign 2 weeks ago, gnawed alder stems at the water's edge. He hadn't told anyone yet. He was saving that one for himself a little longer. Part 4. Restoring More Than History. The National Register nomination paperwork arrived at Elias's kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in August, and it was 47 pages long. He sat with it for a while before he opened the envelope. The rain from last week had moved on, and the morning was clear and already warm, and through the kitchen window he could see the light coming across the field in the particular flat gold way it did in late summer, the kind of light that made everything look like it was holding still on purpose. He drank his coffee and looked at the envelope and thought about Eleanor Bennett writing her letter to the county recorder in October of 1902, not knowing whether anyone would ever read it carefully enough to understand what she was asking. Then he opened it and read every page. The nomination form was a document that reduced the complexity of what he'd found to a series of institutional categories: period of significance, architectural style, integrity of setting, integrity of materials, and he understood why those categories existed and respected the people who maintained them. But reading it felt strange, like reading a medical chart about someone you knew personally. All the facts correct, all the warmth removed by necessity. He called Margaret when he finished. "Did you read it?" she said, picking up on the first ring. "Just finished." "The integrity assessment is strong. Carol said she's never had a first nomination come back from the review office with this few revision requests." "That's good," he said. "Elias." Margaret paused. "There's going to be a public meeting. The Preservation Office wants to hold a community information session about the site before the nomination is finalized. That means people." "I know what a public meeting means." "It means Dale Pruitt," she said. He'd been thinking about that since Carol mentioned the meeting 2 weeks ago. Pruitt had been quiet since the conversation at the fence in June, conspicuously quiet, the kind of quiet that in Elias's experience meant someone was recalibrating rather than retreating. He'd seen Pruitt's truck slow down on the county road twice in the past month. Hadn't stopped, just slowed, then moved on. "Dale Pruitt can come to a public meeting," Elias said. "He might say things. He's allowed to say things." "You're very calm about this." "I'm not calm," Elias said. "I'm just tired of spending energy on what people might say." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "The meeting's in 3 weeks, September 10th, the community center on Mill Street, which, and I did not plan this, is named for the wrong mill. But still, Despite himself, Elias laughed. It came out rough and short, the way laughs did when you were genuinely surprised by something. All right, he said. September 10th. The 3 weeks between the envelope and the meeting were not quiet weeks. Frank Adler's crew came back to complete the subsurface survey of the mill building foundation, and what they found there expanded the site picture in ways that even Tim hadn't fully anticipated from the radar data. The main mill building foundation was larger than the radar signatures had suggested, not because the radar had been wrong, but because the northeast corner of the foundation had been obscured by a secondary feature that the initial survey had read as collapsed roof debris. It wasn't collapsed roof debris. It was a granary annex, a separate stone-floored room attached to the northeast corner of the mill building, its walls still standing to a height of 4 courses, its interior measuring roughly 14 by 18 feet. A granary attached to a grist mill made operational sense. Farmers could bring grain for milling, and the excess could be stored on-site rather than transported twice. Dessaquin sat on an overturned bucket in the cleared area near the granary foundation and made notes in her sketchbook with the focused expression of someone rewriting a mental model in real time. "This changes the site's operational picture," she said to Elias, not looking up from her drawing. This wasn't a one-purpose operation. Mill, sawmill, smithy, granary. This was the economic center of the surrounding community. People came here for multiple services. It would have been a gathering point. "A hub," Elias said. "More than that." She looked up. "A hub implies infrastructure for other things to connect to. What's here implies that other things depended on this for their survival. Remove this operation from the valley in 1860, and you've removed the thing that made the valley function." He thought about that for a moment. "And then in 1902 it closed. And the valley had to find other ways to function," she said. "Or it contracted. Or it changed." She looked at the foundation walls. The history of what happened to this community after 1902 might be partly readable through what you're finding here. It was the kind of thought that expanded rather than closed, and Elias filed it away in the part of his mind where he kept things that would need more time to develop. The Hogs finished their work on the property the last week of August. 79 of the 82 acres fully cleared of the Phragmites monoculture, the root mat broken throughout, the native seed bank germinating across the cleared area in a patchwork of returning wetland vegetation that was already, by late summer, impressive enough that the 2 wetland ecologists Carol had contacted had scheduled a site visit for October. 3 acres in the far southeast corner Elias had left intentionally, a dense stand of mature Phragmites that he'd decided, after some thought, to let stand as a transition buffer between the property and the adjacent farm field. The reeds there weren't harming anything structural, weren't blocking drainage, and provided cover for the migratory birds that were beginning to use the recovering wetland in increasing numbers. Elias had stopped trying to approach every problem on the property as something to be fully eliminated. Some things just needed to be managed, not destroyed. He called Berta to tell her the rotation was complete. "All of it?" she said. 79 acres. Left 3 in the southeast for buffer." "Smart," she said. "The animals?" "Ready to go home whenever you want them." A pause. "How's Gertrude?" "Healthy. She put on weight. Good weight, muscle, over the summer. She's been working hard." "I know she has." Another pause. "I want to see the site before I take them. Can I come Thursday?" "Thursday's fine." Berta came Thursday afternoon. She walked the entire cleared property, all 79 acres, which took the better part of 2 hours. And she didn't say much while she walked. She looked at the native vegetation coming up across the cleared ground, crouched at the water's edge in the open wetland sections, checked the fence lines, checked the hogs. When she reached the mill complex area, she stood for a while at the wheel pit, looking down at the iron axle in its stone-bearing blocks. 79 acres, she said finally. 79 acres. She looked at Gertrude, who was rooting in the last section of disturbed earth near the granary foundation. "She found most of it," Berta said. "She found most of it," he agreed. Berta looked at the wheel pit one more time. Then she said, "When the water runs through that race again, I want to be here." "You will be," he said. The public meeting on September 10th was held in the community center on Mill Street, and it was better attended than anyone had expected. The room had been set for 60 chairs and needed more. Margaret and Carol had put out the word through the County Historical Society, the Preservation Office's newsletter, and the Agricultural Extension Office. And what came back was a turnout that told Elias something he hadn't quite believed until he saw it. A lot of people in Hatchet County had been following what was happening on Parcel 77 without anyone knowing they were paying attention. He arrived early and stood at the back of the room while people filed in. He recognized some of them. Farmers from the surrounding area, a couple of the agricultural extension agents he'd spoken to once or twice, people from Margaret's Historical Society circles. Some faces he didn't know at all. Owen, the graduate student who had posted the photograph and spent a bad day understanding what that meant, sat near the front with a look of deliberate contrition on his face. Dale Pruitt came in at 7 minutes past 7, which was 7 minutes after the meeting had officially started, and sat in the second-to-last row near the door. He didn't look at Elias. Carol opened the meeting. She was measured and precise in the way she always was, presenting the site documentation with slides that Frank's survey crew had compiled. Photographs, survey maps, the radar data visualizations, Dessa's architectural drawings of the structural features. She walked through the history that Margaret had pieced together. Aldous Bennett, 1844 land grant, mill construction 1847, operation through 1902, Eleanor Bennett's letter, abandonment. When she showed the photograph of the iron axle lying in the stone wheel pit, the room was completely quiet. Then Carol introduced Tim, who gave a brief summary of the National Register nomination and what it meant for the site's protection. And then Carol looked at Elias and said, "The property owner would like to say a few words." He hadn't prepared remarks. He'd thought about it and decided that prepared remarks would sound like prepared remarks, and this group deserved better than that. He walked to the front of the room. "I bought this land in January," he said. "I paid $82. Everybody in this county thought I'd lost my mind, and looking back, I understand why they thought that." He paused. "What I want to say tonight is that the land wasn't worthless. It was buried. There's a difference between worthless and buried, and that difference is the entire story of what happened on Parcel 77 this year." He stopped there because he'd said the thing he wanted to say and didn't see a reason to keep going. The room was quiet for a moment. Then a woman near the front, 50s, work jacket, the hands of someone who farmed, raised her hand and said, "What's your plan for the site?" "Restoration and preservation," he said. "Not development, not a commercial attraction. The mill complex will be stabilized and documented. The wetland will continue recovering. The race will be opened when the engineering assessment says it's safe to open. The site will be accessible to the public on a managed basis." "Who pays for that?" a man in the middle of the room asked. "I'm applying for historic preservation grants. The State Preservation Office has identified several programs the site qualifies for. The university's historic preservation program is interested in a partnership for the restoration work." He paused. "And I've been talking to the Agricultural Extension Office about whether the wetland restoration model used here could be replicated on other properties in the watershed." He saw two of the extension agents in the back row exchange a look that was confirmatory rather than surprised, which told him the conversations he'd been having with them had already been traveling further than he'd known. The woman in the work jacket was still looking at him. "The county road flooding," she said. "This past spring it didn't go under at the low crossing." "No," he said. "That hasn't happened in 22 years. "The natural drainage of the watershed changed when the root mat was opened up," he said. "The water has somewhere to go now. The Phragmites was holding it back." The room murmured at that. Not a hostile murmur. Something closer to recalibration. And then Dale Pruitt, from the second to last row, said, "I want to ask something." The room went quieter in a different way. Pruitt stood up. He was a big man, and standing up made him bigger, and he held his cap in both hands in the way of someone who was doing something with his hands so they didn't do something else. He looked at Elias. "I offered you $50 to take that deed back," he said, "in front of a lot of people." "You did," Elias said. The room was very still. "I want to say in front of those same people that I was wrong," Pruitt said. "Not just about the land, about the way I talked to you." He stopped, and Elias could see that this was not an easy thing for Dale Pruitt to do, and that Dale Pruitt was doing it anyway. "I've been farming this county my whole life, and I thought I knew what was worth something and what wasn't. I was wrong about that piece of ground, and I was wrong about you." Nobody said anything. Elias looked at Pruitt for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said, and he meant it, without theater. Pruitt sat down and put his cap back on his head and looked at the floor, and that was the end of that, or the beginning of a different version of it. The engineering assessment of the mill race was completed in October by a civil engineer named Harris Webb, who specialized in historic water infrastructure and who had been recommended by Tim as the best person in the state for this specific work. Harris was 44, laconic, and communicated primarily through precise measurements and occasional declarative statements that left no room for ambiguity. He walked the entire race from headworks to tail race culvert 3 times. He probed the walls in a dozen locations with a slim metal rod, testing for void space behind the face stones. He measured the elevation drop from headworks to wheel pit with an optical level. He inspected the tail race culvert from both ends with a fiber optic camera on a cable. At the end of the second day, he sat down across from Elias at the folding table Elias had set up near the headworks and wrote a number on a notepad and pushed it across the table. "That's the flow rate," Harris said. "Cubic feet per second, based on Briar Creek's seasonal average and the race geometry." Elias looked at the number. "Is that enough to turn the wheel?" "It's enough to turn 2 wheels, Harris said. "The original miller knew what he was doing when he cited this." "Is the race structurally sound enough to carry that flow?" Harris tapped his pen on the notepad. "The race walls are in better condition than most structures I've assessed that are a quarter this age. The headworks are solid. The culvert needs to be cleared of sediment, but the arch is intact." He paused. "The wheel pit will need some work before it can carry a new wheel safely. The bearing blocks have surface degradation that needs to be addressed. That's months of work, not years. And the axle? Ironwork that old, in that condition, and saturated anaerobic sediment. It's actually better than I expected. Surface corrosion, no structural compromise that I can see." He paused again, which with Harris was the equivalent of a long sentence from anyone else. "The mill race can be open. The water will run." Elias sat back. "When?" "Stabilize the bearing block surfaces, clear the culvert, check the headwork sluice mechanism. Spring, if you move on it now." "I'll move on it now," Elias said. Harris nodded. He picked up his pen and notepad. Then he said, without looking up, "I've done this work for 19 years. I want you to know that I have not seen a race in this condition." He put his notepad in his bag. "Someone built this right." "Aldous Bennett," Elias said. "Aldous Bennett," Harris agreed, and got up and walked back to the headworks to take one more measurement. The 2 wetland ecologists who came in October were named Dr. Paula Chin and her graduate student Marcus, and they spent 4 days on the property doing vegetation surveys and water quality sampling and soil assessments that required equipment Elias mostly couldn't name. Paula moved through the recovering wetland with a data recorder and a camera and an expression of sustained professional excitement that she kept trying to moderate and kept failing to fully contain. On the 3rd day, she showed Elias her species count. 41 native wetland species in confirmed germination or active growth, she said. 41. In one growing season, on a site that had been under Phragmites monoculture for an estimated 50 to 70 years. He looked at the list. Blue flag iris he'd recognized, soft stem bulrush, swamp rose mallow. The rest were names he'd written down in his notebook over the past months without knowing their full significance. "Is that unusual?" he said. "Elias." She said his name the way you'd say, "Listen to me." The seed bank viability we're seeing in this soil is extraordinary. Seeds can remain viable in saturated anaerobic conditions for a very long time, so it's decades, in some cases longer for certain species. What was preserved in the soil under the Phragmites mat was a community record of what this wetland looked like before the invasion. What's coming back isn't random, it's a memory. The land is remembering what it was. He didn't say anything for a moment. The land is remembering what it was. "What happens next?" he said. "We need to make sure the recovery trajectory stays on course. There are 3 species on this list that concern me slightly. They're early colonizers that could become competitive if they get ahead of the slower establishing species. We'll monitor those. The migratory bird use," she flipped to another page in her recorder. Marcus counted 27 species during his bird survey on day 1. Yesterday we had 33. In October, at a site that was Phragmites Desert 8 months ago. She shook her head. The word I want to use is remarkable, and I'm aware that's not a scientific term. Use it anyway, he said. She almost smiled. Remarkable, she said. The recovery trajectory on this site is remarkable. Marcus, who had been listening from where he was collecting a soil sample at the water's edge, looked up and said, The beaver lodge is new. I know, Elias said. Marcus looked at him. You knew about the beaver? I've been watching them since August. Marcus put down his sample container and looked at the lodge. A careful construction of gnawed alder and willow branches at the edge of the open water section, unmistakably new, not yet a season old. Beaver recolonization of recovering wetlands that's not something you usually see in the first year. No, Elias agreed. They came because the habitat was there, Marcus said, mostly to himself. The alder came back and the water quality improved and they came. He looked at Elias. You didn't plant anything. You didn't stock anything. You didn't introduce any species. No, Elias said. I just cleared what was blocking the way and let things come back on their own. Marcus looked at the lodge again. That's the whole lesson right there, he said quietly, with the tone of someone who had just had something they already knew confirmed by evidence they hadn't expected. November brought the restoration contractors to the mill race, working in the cold under Harris Webb's supervision, clearing the tail race culvert by hand. Machinery couldn't get close enough without risking the arch, and addressing the bearing block surfaces in the wheel pit with methods that Harris described as conservative, and that Elias described to anyone who asked as slow but correct. It was slow. The bearing blocks were carved limestone, and the surface degradation had to be addressed without altering the original profile. Harris had sourced a materials conservator from the university who came out twice a week and worked with the patience of a person for whom patience was not a virtue but simply the only acceptable approach. Dessa Quinn was overseeing the stabilization of the race walls and the granary foundation, and she and Harris had developed what Elias observed as a productive professional friction. They disagreed on methods regularly and with some heat, and the disagreements almost always produced better outcomes than either of them had reached on their own. Elias tried to stay out of their arguments unless he was asked. He was usually asked. One afternoon in mid-November, standing in the wheel pit while Harris measured the bearing block surfaces, and Dessa argued from the top of the pit wall that the east bearing block needed a different consolidant than the one Harris had specified, Elias looked up at the two of them gesturing at each other across the limestone rim and thought about the auction in January, the cold morning, the folding chairs, Gerald Mott's flat voice reading off the parcel description, 82 acres, South Briar Creek corridor, currently dominated by invasive reed grass and seasonal wetland conditions. 10 months. That was all it had been. 10 months from that cold January morning to standing in an intact 19th century wheel pit while a materials conservator and a civil engineer argued above him about the correct way to stabilize a 170-year-old limestone bearing block. Elias, Dessa called down. Back me up here. The east block needs a breathable consolidant, not a penetrating resin. If Harris uses penetrating resin and the stone has residual moisture, use the breathable consolidant on the east block, Harris said, preempting the argument. I already ordered it. Dessa stopped. Then why were you... I wanted to see if you'd caught the moisture differential, Harris said. He had the expression of a man who conducted tests without announcing them. You did. Dessa stared at him for a moment. That is an extremely annoying way to work. It's effective, Harris said. Elias climbed out of the wheel pit and left them to it. The grant applications went in before the end of November. 3 of them. One to the State Historic Preservation Fund, one to a national foundation that supported working mill restoration, and one to a wetland conservation organization that Paula Chin had connected him to after her site assessment. He wrote all 3 himself at the kitchen table over long evenings in October and November, with his notes and Margaret's historical documents and Dessa's drawings and Frank's survey maps spread out around him. He was not a writer in any professional sense, and he knew it, and he wrote the applications in the same way he'd approached everything on this property, carefully, without pretending to be something he wasn't, staying as close to what was actually true as he could get. The first application came back in December. Approved. He was in the truck on the property access road when the email came through on his phone. He read it twice, then put the phone on the seat beside him and sat there for a while with the engine running and the heat on and the bare December trees visible through the windshield over the recovered wetland. The grant was enough to cover the bearing block restoration, the culvert clearing, the granary foundation stabilization, and the initial engineering work on the headworks sluice. Not enough for everything, but enough to get to spring, enough to open the sluice gate. He called Margaret. "The preservation grant came through," he said when she picked up. "How much?" He told her. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Eleanor Bennett would have been relieved." "I hope so," he said. "She would have," Margaret said. "She asked for future generations to value what she couldn't maintain. You're the future generation she was asking for. You just took a while to show up." He sat in the truck with that for a moment. Outside, a great blue heron crossed low over the wetland, its wing beats slow and deliberate, heading for the open water section where the winter light sat flat and silver on the surface. He watched it land, watched it stand at the water's edge, in the specific motionless way heron stood, as if waiting had never once in its life felt like loss. "Margaret," he said. "Yes. I want to name the site before the spring opening, formally, something that goes on the signage and the grant documentation and the preservation registration." "What are you thinking?" "Bennett Mill Preserve," he said. "Her family built it. Her letter kept it from being forgotten. It should carry their name." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "That's right," she said. "That's exactly right." He started the truck and drove slowly down the access road, past the recovered wetland, past the place where the reed wall had stood in January, past the stone post gate at the road's edge. The second and third grants came back in January. Both approved. The spring opening was set for the first Saturday in May, and there was more work to do before then than Elias could comfortably account for, and the bearing blocks still needed 2 more weeks of consolidation work, and Marcus had flagged a potential problem with one of the early colonizing plant species that needed to be addressed before the growing season started, and Harris wanted to run a low-flow test of the race before the formal opening to check for any settlement issues they hadn't detected. None of it was smooth. None of it arrived on schedule. The culvert clearing hit a buried tree root that nobody had expected and set the work back by a week and a half and caused Harris to use language that Elias had not heard from him before. The materials conservator got sick in February, and the bearing block work stalled for 10 days. The third grant's funding conditions required a reporting structure that added 3 hours to every week Elias had not budgeted for. But the water in the open wetland section was clear. The beaver lodge was still there, expanded now, the animals having been apparently satisfied enough with their first season to commit to a second. The native vegetation was holding its recovery trajectory through the winter, the way Paula had predicted it would. The migratory bird count from Marcus's most recent survey was 41 species, up from the 33 he'd counted in October. The mill race walls stood in the February cold the way they'd stood through 170 winters before this one, patient, solid, waiting for the water to come back. Elias stood at the headworks on a February morning, hands in his jacket pockets, breath rising in the cold air, and looked at the sluice gate tracks cut into the dressed limestone. Those 2 precise vertical grooves that Eleanor Bennett's grandfather had cut by hand in 1847, and that Eleanor herself had slid the closing boards into in October of 1902, and that had held nothing but air and cold for 123 years. Spring was 9 weeks away. He had work to do. He went and got his notebook and started his morning rounds. Part 5, From Mockery to Legacy. The low-flow test happened on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of April, 9 weeks after Elias had stood at the headworks in the February cold and counted down to spring. Harris Webb arrived at 7 with a clipboard and a water quality meter, and the expression of a man who had calculated this moment many times in his head and was now going to find out whether the calculation was correct. Dessa was there. Margaret was there. Frank Adler had driven out on his own time, which told Elias something about what this moment meant to people who worked with historic structures for a living. Berta had driven the 40 minutes from her farm without being asked, arriving in her truck before anyone else, and standing at the headworks with her hands in her jacket pockets saying nothing, which was how Berta expressed that something mattered to her. Carol Pickett had a conflict and couldn't come, a fact she had communicated via text message with 3 question marks at the end that told Elias she was not happy about it. Gerald Tim was there. He'd driven 2 hours. Elias had spent the previous evening at the headworks alone, checking the sluice mechanism one more time. The boards were new, white oak, cut and fitted by a millwright Harris had located through the restoration network, a man named Pete Garza, who worked out of a shop 4 counties over, and who had, upon seeing the sluice gate tracks, spent 20 minutes measuring them with the reverence of a person handling something irreplaceable. Pete had fitted the boards to the tracks by hand, adjusting the width in 3 passes until they seated correctly, and had said when he finished, "Whoever cut these grooves knew what a tolerance meant." Elias had tested the board movement the night before, raising and lowering each board in its track, checking for binding, checking the seal when the boards were seated. The mechanism worked. It was not smooth, exactly. The boards were new oak, and the tracks were old limestone, and there was resistance in the movement that would ease over time as the wood swelled and settled. But it worked. The morning of the test was cool, mid-50s, with a low sky that threatened rain and then didn't deliver. Briar Creek was running at its spring level. Not flood volume, but healthy. The kind of flow that meant the watershed had gotten good winter snowpack and a reasonable March. Harris checked his water quality meter. He looked at the headworks. He looked at Elias. "Ready?" he said. "Ready," Elias said. He put both hands on the top board and pulled it up out of the track. The water moved immediately. Not a rush. A controlled, purposeful surge that filled the upper section of the race channel in about 40 seconds and then pushed downstream in a front that Elias and Harris walked alongside, watching the water reach each section of the race in sequence. The walls held. The base of the channel held. At the 2 spots where Harris had identified minor settling in the October assessment, the water moved past without deviation. At the wheel pit, the water reached the downstream end of the race and poured through the original discharge opening into the pit, hitting the floor stones and spreading. Where the mill wheel had once been, where the axle still lay in its iron-bearing blocks, water now ran over the pit floor and found the tail race outlet and moved into the culvert, and 40 feet later it emerged from the culvert mouth at Briar Creek's bank and rejoined the current. Harris stood at the culvert outlet with his flow meter for about 3 minutes. He wrote a number on his clipboard. He showed it to Elias without saying anything. The flow rate matched his calculation within 4%. Gertrude would have been proud, Elias thought, and almost said it out loud, and didn't, because some thoughts were better kept as your own. Behind him, he heard Tim say something quietly to Frank, and Frank respond. And then there was the sound of Berta clearing her throat in the way she did when she was not going to say what she was feeling, but needed to acknowledge it somehow. Margaret came and stood beside Elias at the culvert mouth, and they both watched Briar Creek carry the mill race water downstream the way it had carried it for 55 years before 1902 and had not carried it for 123 years after. "She asked for future generations," Margaret said. "She did," Elias said. "You were the future generation." "One of them," he said. "There'll be more." Matzagt. The formal opening of Bennett Mill Preserve was set for the first Saturday in May, and in the 3 weeks between the flow test and the opening, the story escaped completely. Not in the way of a single moment of disclosure, more the way water finds its way out of a cracked vessel, slowly, and then all at once. Gerald Tim had mentioned the site in a paper he presented at a regional historic preservation conference in March. One of the attendees had told a journalist. The journalist had done a piece for the state's largest newspaper, a measured, well-researched article that focused on the mill history and the ecological restoration, and mentioned Elias primarily as the landowner who had initiated the work. The piece ran on a Sunday. By Monday evening, Elias had 47 emails in an inbox he checked maybe 3 times a week, and his phone had a voicemail from a public radio station, 2 from universities, and 1 from a documentary filmmaker in Chicago whose name he didn't recognize. He did not respond to most of them immediately. He had a preserve opening to prepare for. The one he did respond to was from a woman named Ruth Aldgate, who wrote in plain, unadorned sentences that she was a retired agricultural extension educator from the eastern part of the state, that she had read the newspaper article, and that she had spent 30 years watching landowners try and fail to manage Phragmites colonization on wetland properties using methods that were expensive, chemically intensive, and largely ineffective. She wrote that she would like to speak with him about the methods used on his property, and she wrote that she understood if he was busy, He called her back that evening. She was 71 and had the directness of someone who had outlasted their tolerance for small talk by at least a decade. "Tell me about the hog rotation," she said, before they'd exchanged much else. He told her. All of it. Berta, the Osabas, the sectioning approach, the timeline, the native germination, the seed bank recovery. He talked for about 20 minutes without much interruption, which was unusual for him. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I've been recommending chemical management to landowners for 30 years because it was the accepted protocol," she said. "I've watched it fail on sites that had the exact same profile as yours. Root mat too deep for surface spray to reach. Regrowth in 2 seasons. Soil chemistry damaged. No seed bank recovery." Another pause. "What you did wasn't new. Heritage hogs have been used for land management for centuries, but nobody in the extension network in this state is recommending it." "Why not?" he said. "Because nobody had a documented case in this region with this kind of outcome data." A pause. "You've been keeping records." "From the beginning, species lists, dates, GPS locations, photographic documentation." "I want to see them," she said, "and I want to bring you in front of the State Extension Educator Network, not to promote anything, just to show them what happened on one piece of ground when someone tried something different." He thought about it for a moment. He thought about the public meeting in September and what it had taken out of him to stand at the front of that room and say what he'd said. He was not a person who sought audiences. "When?" he said. "After your opening," she said. "Give yourself a month." "All right," he said. The opening day came on a Saturday that couldn't decide between spring and summer and split the difference badly. Warm in the sun, cold in the shade, a wind that came and went without apparent logic. Elias had been at the site since 5:30 in the morning, walking the interpretive trail that Dessa and Margaret had planned together over the winter, a gravel path that moved from the parking area along the north bank of the mill race to the headworks, through the mill building foundation with its information panels, past the wheel pit overlook, across the footbridge to the forge floor and granary foundation on the south bank, and back through the open wetland to the trailhead. The information panels were Margaret's work, mostly. She'd written the text herself, and Elias had read every word 3 times and changed almost nothing. She'd found a photograph of the Bennett family, circa 1890, a formal portrait from a county history archive that showed Aldous Bennett's son and his family arranged on the porch of a farmhouse that no longer stood. Eleanor Bennett was in it, 12 years old in the photograph, standing slightly apart from the others with her hands at her sides, and an expression that Elias, looking at it, found impossible to read and impossible to look away from. That photograph was on the first panel of the interpretive trail. Below it, in Margaret's words, "In October 1902, Eleanor Bennett, granddaughter of this mill's founder, closed the sluice gate for the last time and asked the county to keep a record of this structure for the consideration of future generations. 123 years later, the water runs again." He'd read that panel 6 times already this morning. He didn't read it a 7th. He had things to do. The first visitors arrived at 9. By 10:30, the parking area that he and Dale Pruitt's 2 nephews had graded and graveled in March was full, and people were parking along the county road shoulder. Elias had not anticipated this. He probably should have, given what the newspaper article had produced, but he was not a person who naturally thought in terms of crowds, and he hadn't planned for one. Margaret had. She'd arranged for 3 members of the Historical Society to serve as trail guides, and she'd asked Carroll's graduate students to staff the headworks area where the sluice demonstration would happen. She appeared at Elias's side at 10:45 with the calm expression of someone managing something that was larger than expected and finding it manageable. "We need a second demonstration time," she said. "There are too many people for one." "All right," he said. 1:30? "I'll announce it." She looked at the crowd gathering near the headworks. "Elias, look at this." He looked. There were people of every description, old farmers in work clothes, young families with children running on the gravel path, older couples with cameras, a group of what looked like college students who had driven up together, a woman in a university field vest who was almost certainly from Paula Chin's program, 2 men who Elias recognized from Ruth Aldgate's description as extension educators she'd told him to expect. And there, standing at the edge of the headworks area with his hands in the pockets of a clean work jacket, was Dale Pruitt. He wasn't with anyone. He'd come alone. He was looking at the sluice stone the way you look at something you're trying to understand retroactively, working backward from what it turned out to be to what you thought it was, and finding the distance between those two things larger than you'd calculated. Elias walked over. Pruitt saw him coming and didn't move. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Elias said. They stood side by side looking at the headworks for a moment. Below the sluice stone, the boards were seated in their tracks, holding the water back, the race behind it dry and ready. "My father farmed that road," Pruitt said, "and his father before him. 3 generations of us drove past this piece of ground." He stopped. "None of us ever thought to get out and look." "The reeds made it easy not to," Elias said. "That's generous." "It's true," Elias said. "The reeds were doing exactly what invasive species do. They were making the land look like something it wasn't. That's the whole trick." Pruitt looked at him. "Is that how you think about it?" "Most of the time." He paused. "Sometimes I just think people stop looking when they think they already know what they're seeing." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "That's less generous," he said. "It's also true," Elias said. Pruitt almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough. He looked at the headworks one more time, then said, "You need volunteers for this place going forward? Trail maintenance, that kind of thing?" Elias looked at him. "You offering?" "I might be." "Talk to Margaret," Elias said. "She's running the volunteer program." Pruitt nodded. He stood there another minute, then moved off down the trail toward the wheel pit overlook, hands in his pockets, moving carefully on the gravel path with the deliberate step of a big man who'd learned to watch where he was going. The sluice demonstration happened at 11 o'clock, with 40 people standing along the race banks and more arriving every few minutes. Elias stood at the headworks. Carol Pickett had made it after all. Had rescheduled whatever conflict had blocked the flow test and driven up that morning, arriving with 20 minutes to spare and finding a spot at the front of the crowd where she stood with her arms crossed and an expression of focused satisfaction. Elias looked at the crowd. He saw Margaret near the south bank with her clipboard. He saw Tim standing beside Frank Adler. He saw Berta at the back of the group, arms folded, watching him with the same undemonstrative steadiness she'd brought to everything she'd done on this project from the first day she'd backed her trailer up the access road with 10 Ossabaw hogs. He thought about saying something, about Eleanor Bennett, about the 123 years, about what the land had been when he'd bought it and what it was now. He thought about all the ways you could narrate a moment like this and how most of them would make the moment smaller rather than larger. He put his hands on the top sluice board and pulled it up out of its track. The water came in with the same controlled purposefulness it had come in with during the flow test, filling the race channel in that same 40-second sequence, and the crowd followed it downstream along the bank the way crowds naturally follow moving water, walking alongside it. And when it reached the wheel pit and poured in and ran through the tail race and emerged at the creek bank, there was a sound from the group that Elias, standing at the headworks and watching it go, couldn't quite classify. It wasn't applause. It was something older than applause. The sound people make when they watch something come back that was gone long enough to be given up on. He stood at the headworks with the top board in his hands and listened to it, and didn't try to identify what he felt, because some feelings were better left unnamed, and just felt. The second sluice demonstration at 1:30 drew a larger crowd than the first. By then, word had moved through the county road and the surrounding farms and into town in the way word moves in places where people still pay attention to what their neighbors are doing. The total attendance that day was somewhere between 200 and 220, which was more than the population of the nearest small town and more than had attended any public event in Hatchet County in recent memory, according to Margaret, who kept track of such things. Among the second-round arrivals were 6 students from the regional high school's environmental science class, brought by their teacher, a woman in her 30s named Dana Hollis, who had read the newspaper article and added it to her curriculum immediately. She'd brought the students with notebooks and a list of questions she'd prepared in advance, and Elias spent 40 minutes answering them while Margaret took the class through the interpretive trail. One of the students, a girl of about 16 who had been taking notes faster than Elias could speak, looked up from her notebook and said, "What would have happened to this place if you hadn't bought it?" He thought about it for a moment. "Someone else would have bought it eventually," he said. "Maybe they'd have done what I did. Maybe they'd have cleared it with equipment and found the mill that way." But maybe not, she said. Maybe not, he agreed. So you were just the person who happened to look, she said. He considered arguing with that reduction. It wasn't entirely wrong, but it left out all the things that had enabled the looking. The years of land work, the knowledge of what to look for, the willingness to wade in with his boots getting wet before he'd bought a single acre. It left out the risk and the savings account and the months of nobody believing it and the specific exhaustion of doing something that everyone around you thinks is a mistake. But he looked at the girl's notebook and her careful handwriting and decided that she'd gotten the essential truth of it, and the rest was detail. Yeah, he said. I was the person who happened to look. She wrote that down. 5 years from the date of the auction, Bennett Mill Preserve was a different place from what any reasonable person standing in that county annex parking lot in January could have predicted, and Elias knew that, and he still found it hard to hold in his mind all at once. The interpretive trail had been extended in the second year, adding a wetland boardwalk through the open water section that allowed visitors to move through the marsh without disturbing the vegetation. Paula Chin's monitoring program had documented 63 native wetland plant species in confirmed growth on the site by year 3, up from 41 in that first remarkable season. The migratory bird list stood at 78 species across 5 years of surveys, a number that Marcus, now finishing his doctorate with the preserve as a central case study, described in his dissertation as ecologically anomalous in the best possible sense. The beaver colony had expanded. 3 lodges now, spread across the open water area, and the beaver activity had done something to the site's hydrology that even Harris Webb hadn't anticipated. The dams the animals had built in the smaller channels of the recovering wetland created a series of stepped water retention features that slowed the drainage from the property during heavy rain events and released it slowly over subsequent days. The county road flooding at the low crossing, which had been a reliable annual problem for 22 years before the Hogs went to work on Parcel 77, had not occurred in 5 years. Not once. Elias had not planned for the beavers. He had not introduced them, had not managed their activity beyond making sure their dam building didn't compromise the structural integrity of the mill race walls, which it hadn't because the animals had avoided the dressed stone with what felt almost like deliberate respect. He had simply created the conditions and gotten out of the way, which was the same thing he'd done with the hogs and the native seed bank and the whole 82 acres from the beginning. He thought about that sometimes, about how much of what had happened here was his doing and how much was not. The honest answer was that the proportion was uncomfortably small. He'd bought the land, he'd brought the hogs, he'd kept the records and called the right people and held the careful line between moving too fast and moving too slow. But the seed bank had been waiting before he arrived. The limestone had been waiting. The mill race, the wheel pit, the iron axle, the sluice gate tracks, all of that had been sitting in the ground since 1902, since before Elias Rowan was born, since before anyone at the county auction had drawn a breath. He had not created anything. He had uncovered things that were already there. That distinction mattered to him in a way he found hard to articulate to most people, but tried to articulate to Ruth Aldgate's Extension Educator Network when he spoke to them 6 weeks after the opening, and tried again to the university students who came through on field visits, and tried again and again to the farmers from surrounding counties who began, in the second and third years, to call him with questions about their own reed-colonized parcels, and their own problem wetlands, and their own pieces of ground that everyone had decided were worthless. He told them all the same thing, which was not a speech but just what he'd found to be true. The land is not your enemy. Most of the time, the land is trying to do something, and the question is whether you're willing to figure out what that something is before you decide it needs to be stopped. Some of them listened, some of them nodded and went home and called the excavation company anyway. That was their right. He wasn't in the business of converting people, and he'd learned early that the most persuasive argument was not any argument you made with words, but the 79 acres of recovering native wetland you could walk someone through on a Tuesday morning and let them draw their own conclusions. In the 4th year, the State Preservation Office approached Elias about the mill wheel. The question of whether to reconstruct the wheel had been on the table since the 1st year, and Elias had been in no hurry to resolve it. A reconstructed wheel was not a historic wheel. It was a contemporary object in a historic location, and the line between interpretation and fabrication was one he wanted to walk carefully. He'd talked to Tim about it repeatedly, and Tim's position had evolved from wait and see to the educational value is significant to by year 3, the axle is still in the bearing blocks. It's asking for a wheel. Harris Webb's position had been consistent throughout. Structurally, the wheel pit could support a new wheel. The axle, examined in year 2 by a metallurgist, was sound. The bearing blocks, now fully consolidated, were as stable as Harris could make them. The engineering was not the obstacle. The millwright was Pete Garza, who had fitted the sluice boards and who agreed to the commission with a quietness that told Elias he had been hoping to be asked. Pete spent 3 months on the wheel design, working from Tim's historical documentation, from the bearing block dimensions, from the wheel pit geometry. He came out 4 times to measure and 4 times to stand at the edge of the wheel pit looking at the axle with the expression of a craftsman calculating a relationship between what existed and what he was going to make. The wheel went in on a Thursday in October of the 4th year. A 12-foot overshot wheel, white oak and iron, built the way Aldous Bennett's original wheel had been built, turning on the iron axle that had been waiting in its stone-bearing blocks since the year a young woman named Eleanor wrote a letter and closed the sluice and walked away from the only future her grandfather had built. When the water ran over the new wheel for the first time, the wheel turned. It was not immediate. The initial resistance of the new wood and the old iron was significant, and Pete had to make 2 adjustments to the sluice board positions to get the flow volume right. But it turned. Slowly, then, with gathering purpose, the paddles catching the overshot flow and pulling the wheel through its arc, the axle rotating in the bearing blocks that had held it motionless for 122 years. Elias stood at the wheel pit overlook and watched it turn and did not say anything for a long time. Pete Garza came and stood beside him. He looked at the wheel turning in the water and said, "That's right." "Yes," Elias said. "That's exactly right," Pete said. They stood there together while the wheel turned and the water moved through the race the way it had moved through for 55 years before 1902 and not moved for 122 years after, and the sound it made, the water and the wood and the old iron, was not a triumphant sound and not a dramatic one. It was a working sound, the sound of something doing what it was built to do. Berta came to the wheel dedication the following Saturday, the public event Pete had stayed for, and stood with Elias at the overlook while the crowd gathered along the race bank and the wheel turned in the October light. "You remember that first Sunday?" she said. "The trailer," he said. "Yes." Gertrude went straight for the reeds. "She always knew where she was going," he said. Berta was quiet for a moment. "She died in the spring," she said. "April." He turned to look at her. She'd lost animals before. She ran a working operation, and she was not sentimental about it in the way that people who didn't work with animals imagined you should be. But there was something in the way she said it. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "She was 10, Berta said. "That's a good life for an Ossabaw." She looked at the wheel turning in the water. "She cleared 26 of those 79 acres herself. I went back and figured it out from your records." 26 acres, he said. 26. She looked at the wheel one more time. "I want you to put something up," she said, "on the site. Something small. Just says what the animals did here. Not a monument, just an acknowledgement." He thought about it. "A marker on the trailhead," he said. "Something that explains the restoration method. How the hogs worked the land." "With their names," Berta said. "With their names," he agreed. The marker went up the following spring, at the trailhead where the interpretive trail began, near the photograph of Eleanor Bennett at 12 years old. It was a simple panel, not large. It explained the Phragmites' colonization, the decision to use heritage hogs for root mat disruption, the Ossabaw Island breed, the rotation method, the timeline. At the bottom, under the heading "The Animals That Restored This Land," it listed the 10 hogs by name. Gertrude was first. The day the panel went up, Elias stood at the trailhead and read it in full, even though he'd read the draft text 6 times. The morning was warm, a May morning not unlike the one 5 years ago when he'd stood at the edge of the reed wall with Berta and watched Gertrude push into it for the first time. The recovering wetland stretched behind him across the property, open water and bulrush and native grass, and the patient geometry of the mill race running at 63 feet from headworks to wheel pit, the wheel turning in its stone chamber, the water moving on. He heard footsteps on the gravel and turned. It was the girl from Dana Hollis's environmental science class. She was 21 now, a second-year student at the State University studying ecology, and she'd come back to the preserve 4 times since that first visit as a high school student. He'd learned her name eventually, Cora. "The new panel looks good," she said. "Margaret wrote most of it," he said. "I know, she told me." She looked at Gertrude's name at the top of the list. "I want to do my senior thesis on the restoration ecology here. Paula Chin is going to advise it." "I know," he said. "She told me." Cora looked at him. "Is that okay with you?" "It's more than okay," he said. She nodded, satisfied. She looked out at the wetland for a moment, at the wheel visible beyond the headworks, at the beaver lodge in the open water section where, even at this distance, a beaver was visible doing something purposeful at the dam face. "You know what I keep thinking about?" she said. "What?" "All the places like this that nobody's looked at yet," she said. "All the land that everyone's already decided is worthless." He looked at her. She was 21, and she was standing at a trailhead named for a woman who died before anyone now living was born, on land that had been sold for $1 an acre because no one thought it was worth their time to get their boots wet, and she was thinking about the next place. "Yeah," he said. "There's a lot of it." "Someone has to look," she said. "Someone always has to look," he said. She pulled out a notebook, battered, spiral-bound, the same kind he carried, and wrote something in it. He didn't ask what. She'd tell him when she was ready or she wouldn't, and either way the work would be the work. He turned back to the panel and read Eleanor Bennett's name one more time. 12 years old in that photograph, standing slightly apart, hands at her sides. 123 years of asking. The wheel turned. The water ran. The land remembered what it was. He picked up his notebook and started his morning rounds.